Hello and welcome to Seeking Rents, the podcast. I'm your host, Jason Garcia. I am the publisher of Seeking Rents, a newsletter in Florida about state politics, but with a particular emphasis on the ways that big businesses and other special interests influence public policy in this state. I figured I'd record another quick show now that the Florida Legislature has just wrapped up its, I think, third special session in 2 weeks. Although it's all really been one big special session around immigration as they fought with the governor over immigration policy. That fight finally came in for a landing this week with the legislature passing a couple of bills, and the governor dutifully signing it after ripping the legislature, trying to pick a fight with the legislature and pretty clearly losing that fight. I'm not gonna spend a whole lot of time on the actual bills the legislature passed this week because honestly, not a whole lot has changed from the bills they passed 2 weeks ago that we spent quite a bit of time discussing. It is essentially one giant exercise in performative toughness, while ignoring root problems and very obviously cowering away from anything that might upset the big business lobby. So, and what I mean by that is these bills that the legislature passed this week and that the governor signed are basically all about like criminal enforcement. And so like there's a bunch of enhanced penalties for unauthorized aliens who commit crimes in Florida. There's a bunch of money that's being thrown into, law enforcement agencies to help them with pursue these crimes, to work with federal ICE and other federal agencies on deportations, that sort of thing. And of course, there's, as we talked about, there also in these bills is stripping the right to in-state tuition away from children of undocumented immigrants who were brought to this state, through no decision of their own, whose families have been paying taxes in a state that is run by sales taxes. So taxes don't care about, no retailer is checking your documentation status before they take your money and you pay your taxes there. They're stripping that away from students, dreamers they're called, even folks that are enrolled in school right now. So there's purely just unnecessarily cruel. There's a bunch of people in Tallahassee that seem to have a cruelty itch that they need to scratch here. But while they do all of that stuff, they continue to ignore employment of undocumented, unauthorized immigrants or aliens in Florida. There was a lot of discussion this week around the state's E-Verify law, which the Ron DeSantis loves to sort of brag about sort of getting done in Florida. Except the immigration, the E-Verify law on the books exempts the vast majority of employers that do not have to comply with E-Verify. And so there was an attempt on the floor of the Florida Senate this week while they were debating this bill to change that, to require all businesses in Florida to use E-Verify to verify the documentation status of all of their employees. And Republican leaders in the Florida Senate refused to even hear it. They found a way to rule it out of order, also they could avoid taking a vote on that issue. Of course, after it happened, there was a bunch of Republican senators hopping on Twitter to claim how they would have voted for it if they could, because they're tough, right? We would have done this. It's just the rules, man. What can you do? What can you do about the rules? Is if only they had some sort of supermajority where they could waive rules if necessary. It's all just so sad. And then this all happened again when during the signing ceremony the governor did with the speaker and the Senate president, where he signed these bills, and this question was asked again. And it just becomes one giant exercise in buck passing. So the governor blames the legislature for not doing it. The legislature blames the governor for not enforcing E-Verify. So why would they enhance it if they don't know it's working? The governor then blames the legislature for not giving enough funding to enforce it, right? Everybody just keeps pointing a finger at somebody else, and lo and behold, the problem never gets resolved. I wonder why that is. I wonder why this is the one issue they keep refusing to address, right? So anyway, that's the bill that passed. We're not going to lift a finger about corporations exploiting undocumented immigrant labor, but we are going to, rip a few hundred or a few thousand kids out of. We're going to force them to either pay 3 times as much to finish their education, or have them drop out of school entirely for no good reason other than it makes you feel like you pretend to be a tough guy while you do it. Honestly, as we've talked about before, the most interesting dynamic in all of this has been the political dynamic to these bills, and specifically, this has been the Florida legislature sort of standing up to Ron DeSantis for the first time in half a decade or more, and taking a guy who's just been the biggest bully in all of Florida politics and kicking him in the teeth over and over again, and frankly, making him smile about it this week. Honestly, this legislation, the final package, the compromise on immigration here, turned out far worse for Ron DeSantis than even I kind of imagined. You know, I'm a guy who was sort of really, really enjoying watching him get swirled over and over again. You know, I think I said the other week, I kind of predicted one of the biggest, most politically intriguing dynamics of this is one of the things the legislature did was in their original bill was they were going to strip all immigration enforcement from the governor and give it to the state's agriculture commissioner, an independently elected official and a guy that also Ron DeSantis has had like a really rough relationship with because he has a rough relationship with just about everybody, it seems like. And, you know, as you tried to sort of game out how this stuff would come together, it was like it seemed impossible that Ron DeSantis could ever sign something like that. It seemed clear that he was going to have to win on at least that point because he's not going to sign a bill that strips him of immigration authority and gives it to somebody else. I was wrong. He sort of ended up doing it. Now, they came up with this compromise situation where they're giving like immigration oversight in Florida to the governor and the cabinet combined, where the cabinet, which includes the attorney general, the agriculture commissioner, and the chief financial officer, all of which are independently elected positions, they each will oversee this, and it's got to be like unanimous consent. So each one has like equal power on this, which is going to be an enormous check on sort of the governor's ability to do things like, you know, kidnapping a bunch of Venezuelan migrants from the Texas border and flying them to Martha's Vineyard so he can get some airtime on Fox News about it, you know. And the governor signed this bill smiling and claiming it as a win. That's pretty wild to me. I did not see that coming. Honestly, the biggest sort of political win he seemed to get out of this, other than just sort of like getting out of the fight for now, is convincing the legislature to stop calling this the Trump Act, so he didn't have to sit there and sign the Trump Act. He avoided that little humiliation, at least. You know, Jim DeFede, the just phenomenal investigative TV reporter in Miami, has a really sort of devastating takedown of how all this turned out for the governor. I'll post a link to that in the show notes. But, you know, from my perspective, the most interesting thing of the week actually happened a few hours later after the governor had signed this stuff and the immigration special session was finally done. And that's when the Florida Supreme Court suddenly started kicking Ron DeSantis around too. I don't know if we've talked about this. I don't think I've written about it on the newsletter or anything like that, but there has been a controversy that has quickly erupted involving state senator or a candidate for state senate. Her name is Debbie Mayfield, and she was in the state senate for 8 or 10 years. I don't remember exactly because there are redistricting issues, but she hit term limits. And so she was forced to retire from the state senate this year. And she ended up running for House. So now she's back in the Florida House. So like, just sort of like bouncing back and forth like a pinball. But then after Trump was elected, there was like a cascading effect. He appointed a number of people from Florida to his administration. One of those opened up a congressional seat. The person who got elected to Debbie Mayfield's state Senate seat, Randy Fine, one of kind of the more bombastic Republicans in Florida, is about to win election to that congressional seat, which is opening up the state Senate seat again. And Debbie Mayfield has announced that she's going to run for it. So she's essentially running for a seat that she was forced out of like 2 months ago because of the state's term limits law. So anyway, this is all happening. Qualifying for this election was last week or the week before. I don't remember exactly which, but Debbie Mayfield filed all the paperwork. She met all the filings she had to do, but the DeSantis administration ruled that she was ineligible and refused to qualify her for the ballot. And they ruled that she was ineligible under Florida's term limits law. And so the backstory here is Debbie Mayfield is one of the few Florida legislators that endorsed Donald Trump over Ron DeSantis back when Ron DeSantis was running his campaign, such as it was, for president against Donald Trump. And of course, so there's hostility to begin with right there, and that hostility has only grown as the legislature has exerted its independence these last couple of weeks in the immigration fight. And Debbie Mayfield has been a pretty strong supporter of the legislature standing up to the governor like this. And so what you had here was a pretty obvious case of the DeSantis administration kind of retaliating against Debbie Mayfield by refusing to let her qualify for the ballot. And there are actually two different legal issues that matter. The first is whether or not the DeSantis administration, and this is via the Division of Elections and the Secretary of State, who's a DeSantis appointee, um, whether or not they had the power to decide that she was ineligible under term limits. There's an issue whether or not this is the Division of Elections, the Department of State perform like what is called a ministerial role. That basically, if you just meet the stuff on paper, if you file the paperwork you're supposed to, you sign the oath of office, you fill out your financial disclosure, all those kinds of basic things, you open a campaign account, appoint a treasurer, they have to qualify you as long as you meet those. That they do not have the power to then turn around and like rule whether or not the oath you're signing is accurate or whether or not you're disclosing. They don't have any sort of investigative or adjudicative power. And so there was a legal question about whether or not the Ron DeSantis could even stop her from qualifying from the ballot to begin with. Then there was the separate question of whether or not she was actually eligible under Florida's term limits laws. And so I will say I am of the mind she is ineligible. And without getting too far into the weeds, the Constitution basically prohibits people from serving more than 8 consecutive years in the state house or state senate. Debbie Mayfield, assuming she wins election here and then continues to win re-election, will end up serving something like 16 to 20 consecutive years in the state senate with just like a gap of about 60 days or something like that, which not only violates the spirit of the term limits law, I believe violates the letter of the law, which says, again, it's 8 consecutive years. It's not 2,562 consecutive days or whatever it is. So an argument that's always really resonated to me is like when you think about how people talk, like if I told you I'd watch TV every day for the last week, you wouldn't think I'd watch television for every single hour of the last 7 days, right? You'd think I'd watch some television each day for the last 7 days. And so I was of the belief that I personally thought she should be ruled ineligible. I will freely admit it's not there's a compelling legal argument the other way that it should be interpreted as like 8 continuous years rather than just consecutive years. Anyway, the Florida Supreme Court ruled against the DeSantis administration on both points. It ruled that he did not have the power to block Debbie Mayfield from the ballot, and that they did not have the power to keep her off the ballot in the first place, and B, that she was still eligible. She would not be violating Florida's term limits law. Got to say, don't love the second half of that ruling. I think it kind of allows her to make a mockery of term limits in Florida. At the same time, it was pretty clear, like I said, the governor was weaponizing the state agency, the Division of Elections, against an opponent here, and that obviously had to stop. But what really stood out at this, not just that the court ruled against the governor, it was the fact that it ruled so aggressively against him. I mean, there is some like really nasty language in this ruling. I'll post a tweet thread I did on this with a couple of the screenshots. But at one point, Justice Charles Kennedy wrote a concurring opinion. Charles Kennedy, who is one of only a couple of judges one of only 2 on the 7-member Supreme Court who is not a DeSantis appointee, but has long been one of the most conservative justices in Florida, and is also whose wife is a member of the Florida House and going to be Speaker of the House in a few years. He wrote at one point about the arguments that the DeSantis administration was trying to make. And this was specifically when it was trying to pretend that it had the power to keep Debbie Mayfield off the ballot to begin with. He goes, quote, "This is not the sort of argument that any litigant, much less an officer of the state of Florida, should present in any court." Like, again, you're dealing with legal briefs, so the language has to be somewhat restrained. But that is like, in court speak, that's a sick burn, right? And we have not seen this out of the Florida Supreme Court in years. I am convinced if this exact same controversy had presented itself in, say, 2023, when everybody thought Ron DeSantis was Donald Trump's heir apparent, when he had all these, grassroots MAGA supporters seemed to love him, and there was a whole bunch of national billionaires who were just desperate for somebody who could bring the base along, but who was not Donald Trump, who was more controllable than Donald Trump. When it looked like he was at the apex of his power, I would bet all that I own that the Florida Supreme Court would have just found a way to avoid addressing any of these issues. It wouldn't have issued a ruling saying DeSantis could do what he was doing. It would have found a way to not address it and say there is no standing here, or we don't have the power to do the remedy that Debbie Mayfield is seeking. They would have dodged the issue and allowed Ron DeSantis to win. That is what we have seen the courts do over and over and over for the past 5 years, as again, Ron DeSantis has just bullied the entire state, including Republican leaders, other Republican leaders. So to see the Florida Supreme Court sort of push back this aggressively, just wild. And to do so after the Florida legislature finished like completely uh, completely emasculating him in a way, even more so than I thought, than I expected they would go. That was, it is that was shocking. I did not see that coming. I did not, certainly not in this kind of aggressive language. I thought there was a good chance they might rule against him on the point of not having the power to keep her off the ballot, but certainly not in these strident terms. Now we'll have to see, is this indicative of a new Supreme Court? Do we have a court that's like as anxious to assert its independence as the Florida legislature clearly is? This was a particularly bad, egregious case of lawfare by the DeSantis administration. So, in one sense, it's a very easy one to really sort of smack him around over. So the question going forward will be in closer cases, like one of the big issues we've had in Florida is the governor starting to suspend independently elected local officials over what amount to policy disagreements, something no governor has ever done before. And in the past, the Florida Supreme Court has been willing to look the other way and just find ways not to get involved. We've talked a lot about the DeSantis administration, I would argue, illegally interfering with the Amendment 3 and Amendment 4 campaigns, the abortion and marijuana ballot initiatives last fall. Again, the Florida Supreme Court and other courts kept finding ways not to get involved. No jurisdiction, no standing. Just avoid taking side and issuing rulings that have the effect of allowing Ron DeSantis to do whatever he wants without actually legally blessing it. So, obviously we're going to have to pay more attention to some of these cases and see what they do on some of these closer call legal issues. But man, it sure looks like it is the Florida Ron DeSantis has known for the first 6 years of his administration is over. I'm kind of convinced. There was a story that broke last week, I think, where suddenly word started to spread that donors were encouraging Casey DeSantis to run. And Ron DeSantis was asked somewhere about it and sort of didn't bat that down. He sort of like, it's really flattering she's being asked, and he'll be supportive of whatever she decides or something like that. I'm vaguely paraphrasing, but I'm kind of convinced that this is a manufactured story by like the DeSantis is desperately trying to cling to some sort of relevance or some sort of like leverage to stop them from sliding into like the world's earliest lame duck status. That they're trying to sort of maintain the illusion that there might still be a DeSantis in the governor's mansion 2 years from now. Because, man, nobody seems to care what he thinks right now, and among other Republicans. I mean, I should be careful. I should sort of, it is easy to get lost in the enthusiasm of watching a bully get punked, but, these guys are still aligned on a lot of awful stuff. I mean, they really taking away in-state tuition from kids who are currently in school, kids who did nothing wrong. They didn't commit any crimes. They didn't come to this country on their own. Taking that away, that's like a really just like cold-hearted thing to do. They still did that because Ron DeSantis was the first guy that pushed that idea. So there still is a limit to sort of how far this kind of pushback goes when ultimately a lot of these guys are aligned on some of these issues. And like we said earlier, both these guys seem perfectly aligned on making sure they don't upset the big business lobby on any of this immigration posturing too. So now we begin looking forward to the main session, which starts first week of March. So it's less than a month away now. The state has a 60-day legislative session where an awful lot of bad shit can happen very fast. We're already seeing some like really concerning bills starting to file. They've seen bills that could like carve new loopholes into the state's minimum wage law or allow landlords to evict tenants by email or, protecting the phosphate industry from protecting their legal exposure to pollution claims, that sort of thing. There's already a bunch of bills coming in to roll back local home rule power, stop cities and counties from doing anything about like litter or everything from litter to charter schools to, their own construction projects, their own contracting decisions, all of that stuff we could see. A whole bunch more preemptions is what we call them. We just had a story on the newsletter this week about the car dealers. One of the most rent-seeking lobbies in any state capital are lobbying for another bill that would basically to further empower them to shut down any attempt by consumers to buy cars if through any way other than through a middleman dealer. I'll post a link to that story in the show notes as well. I meant to say this earlier. I'm going to post a link to the Supreme Court rulings in that case in the show notes for anybody that wants to read them. You can sort of see what I mean by they were particularly aggressive in how they shut the governor down there. And honestly, the most concerning thing to me probably from this past week was almost like a line, a comment Ron DeSantis made during his press conference in response to a question where he made it sound like as very early in session, the Florida legislature is going to go after ballot initiatives and trying to make it even harder for Floridians to amend their own constitution. This is, again, a retaliation to the near passage of last year's Amendment 3 and 4. Amendment 4, the one that would have overturned the state's abortion ban and got more than 57% of the vote, but just short of the 60% supermajority you need in Florida. Was a legacy of the big business lobby. And then Amendment 3, which was the amendment that would have legalized recreational marijuana, got about just over 55% of the vote. Already we've seen the marijuana folks are restarting a petition to try and get on the 2026 ballot. Separately, there's an amendment going to require Medicaid expansion in Florida to extend health insurance to more lower and middle income Floridians, an idea that essentially the big national billionaire lobby essentially hates because they're worried about anything might actually lead folks to enforce corporate income taxes or marginal, wealth taxes, that sort of thing. They want to cut any sort of path, any sort of potential pressure for those kinds of policy decisions. So they try and deny any kind of expansion of benefits to more people. The governor said, and I'm looking at his quotes, I'm confident they're going to address that. He said of the legislation, I think probably pretty early in session from what I hear. So, it's not clear to me that Ron DeSantis has any more insights into the Florida legislature right now than I do, but presumably he's heard that from someone. And if he's right that this is coming and it's coming quickly, this is going to be one of the biggest battles of the Florida legislature's 2025 session. This fight over access to the ballot and preserving citizens' ability to amend their own constitution. This fight is coming, and it could be coming as soon as like 3 weeks from now. So I'm sure we'll have lots more to say on that. And with that, let's cut it there, and we'll check in again probably next week, which I believe is the final week of committee hearings ahead of the 2025 session. So we'll be back again in a few days. Until then, thanks as always for listening. Don't forget to sign up for the newsletter if you haven't already. SeekingRentsFL.com is the easiest way to find us. If you've got the ability, please think about paying for a subscription. We don't require payments, but those voluntary paid subscriptions are super helpful to funding the costs of reporting expenses like public records requests. And if you are watching this on YouTube, please make sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons. Building the subscriber base on YouTube is really helpful to getting our content out to more folks. So, okay, we'll leave it there, and we'll talk again soon. See ya. Bye-bye.